It starts with something small, a comment that stings but you swallow it, a moment where you wanted to scream but instead you smiled, and somewhere inside, a message gets sent. What you feel isn't safe to show. Not because anyone said those words out loud, but because every time your anger surfaced as a child, it was met with punishment, silence, or shame. So you learned the only way to survive was to make it disappear. This is how a child becomes a peacekeeper. Not because they're naturally calm, but because rage became dangerous. Maybe it was a parent who couldn't handle your frustration. Maybe it was a household where anger meant chaos, yelling, doors slamming, someone leaving. And so you did the only thing that made sense to a small nervous system trying to stay safe. You buried it. You smiled through it. You became agreeable, easygoing, low maintenance. And the world praised you for it. You're so easy to get along with. You never caused problems. But no one ever asked what that cost you. Psychologists call this emotional suppression, and over time, it doesn't just change how you act, it changes how you feel. Because when a child is taught that anger is unacceptable, they don't stop feeling angry. They just stop feeling it consciously. The emotion doesn't vanish, it goes underground. And what goes underground doesn't die. It waits, it compounds, it collects interest in the dark, quietly, patiently, until one day it starts leaking out in ways you don't even recognize as anger anymore. This is where the body enters the story, because rage that isn't expressed doesn't evaporate. It gets stored in your shoulders, in your jaw, in your stomach that tightens before conflict, in the headaches that show up after a conversation you should have spoken up in but didn't, in the fatigue that has no medical explanation. Your body remembers what your mind was taught to forget. It keeps score even when you've stopped counting. So what happens to a person who learned to swallow their rage? They become masters of passive tension. They say, "It's fine," when it isn't. They agree when they want to argue. They laugh off things that actually hurt. They apologize first, even when they did nothing wrong, just to end the discomfort faster. And underneath all of that composure is a slow-burning resentment that never gets named, because naming it feels dangerous. Even now, even as an adult, even when no one's watching, you might notice it in small ways. You snap at something minor and then feel confused by your own reaction. You feel exhausted after being around certain people, but can't explain why. You avoid conflict so completely that you'd rather abandon your own needs than risk someone's disapproval. You might even feel numb in moments that should make you furious, because somewhere along the way, you disconnected from the signal entirely. You've gotten so good at managing your face that you sometimes forget what's actually happening underneath it. Here's the part most people don't realize. Suppressed anger doesn't make you calm. It makes you disconnected from a part of yourself that was trying to protect you. Because anger, at its core, isn't destruction. It's information. It tells you when a boundary has been crossed. It tells you when something isn't right. It tells you when you deserve better. And when you're taught to silence that signal early enough, you lose access to one of the most important tools you have, the ability to know when something is wrong before it's too late. So instead, the rage finds other ways out. It shows up as irritability toward people who didn't deserve it. It shows up as a short temper over something small because the real target was never available to confront. It shows up as passive aggression, sarcasm, the silent treatment, because direct anger was never modeled as safe, so indirect anger became the only language you knew. It shows up in the version of you that goes quiet mid-conversation, that stops answering texts instead of saying what's wrong, that smiles in the room and seethes in the car afterward. And this is the tragic irony. The child who suppressed their anger to keep the peace often grows into an adult who unconsciously creates tension anyway, just in quieter, more confusing ways. Not because they want conflict, but because the anger has to go somewhere. And when it isn't allowed out the front door, and it slips out the back, disguised as moodiness, disguised as distance, disguised as being just tired. Now you might ask, why would a child choose silence over expression? Because expression felt like risk, and silence felt like survival. A child doesn't calculate the long-term cost of suppression. They only know what keeps them safe in the moment. And safety, to a child, is worth almost anything, even the abandonment of their own truth. This isn't a character flaw, it's a nervous system doing exactly what it was built to do. Prioritize connection over authenticity, because to a child, disconnection can feel like death. But here's the cost that catches up with you later. When you spend years swallowing anger, you don't just lose access to rage. You lose access to your own voice. You start apologizing for taking up space. You start shrinking your reactions before anyone else even responds. You start rehearsing conversations in your head, softening every sentence, removing every sharp edge because sharpness once meant danger. You become fluent in a language of politeness that says everything except what you actually mean. And underneath all of that restraint is a question you've probably never said out loud. What would happen if I actually let myself feel this? What would happen if I stopped managing everyone's comfort and just told the truth about what hurt? What would happen if just once I let the anger exist without immediately trying to smooth it over? The healing doesn't start with releasing the rage all at once. It starts with acknowledging it exists, because you cannot heal what you refuse to feel, and you cannot feel what you've spent your whole life being taught to hide. This isn't about becoming volatile or letting every irritation explode outward. It's about ending the war between what you feel and what you allow yourself to show. This is where the real work begins. Not explosive confrontation, not blame, but reconnection. Learning to notice the tightness in your chest before you say, I'm fine. Learning to pause before you swallow the next comment that deserved to be spoken. Learning that anger, expressed with clarity instead of shame, isn't something to fear. It's something to finally trust. It's learning to say, that hurt me, instead of laughing it off. It's learning to say, I disagree, instead of nodding along until the resentment builds. Because the truth is, your anger was never the problem. It was trying to protect a version of you that had no other way to be protected. It was the only voice you had when your real voice wasn't allowed. And it's still there now, waiting, not for permission to explode, but for permission to finally be heard. Not to burn everything down, but to simply say, this mattered, and I'm allowed to say so. So if you're someone who learned to swallow your rage, know this. Your calm was never weakness, and it was never a lie either. It was a strategy that once kept you safe, but you're not that child anymore. You get to feel what you feel without apologizing for it. You get to say what hurts before it turns into resentment. You get to stop performing peace and start living in an honesty that finally includes all of you, even the parts you were taught to hide. And maybe, for the first time, you'll notice something strange. When you stop swallowing your anger, you don't become someone angrier. You become someone lighter. Because what you've been carrying all these years was never peace. It was silence. And silence is heavy. But your voice, your real voice, was always meant to be light.